You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Well, the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucuses have come and gone, and we didn't cover them, and the world didn't end. Not yet, that is. Of course, both states are terminally white, and Iowa, other than having the Iowa Writers' Workshop, can be a bit of a problem. See, not only does Iowa boast having a life-size butter cow, you heard that right, a butter cow, the size of a real cow, big buttered cow, and it's been carved out of butter, many sticks of butter. But also, not only do they have a butter cow, never mind. But also, the caucuses are held at night. So guess what? Parents can't attend, which means mothers, which means women, which drastically reduces attendance of women. And there's no child care available, which further restricts attendance. And the caucuses are held in freezing weather with icy roads, which makes attendance more and more minuscule, sort of a few white male farmers, basically, all of them that do come obsessed with ethanol. But that means, happily, that for another week at least we can enjoy Fables for grown-ups. This week's fable is titled The Child Who Could Read Rivers, and it's from my book, Parallax, published by Spinifex Press. And I think it's a nice story, a strange story. Anyway, we will read it, and we will return with it uncut and read the whole thing directly after this message and this short break. So stay with us. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
And now for our story, The Child Who Could Read Rivers. It's from Parallax, my book published by Spinifex Press. Long ago, in the days when truths and gods were plural, it was the old women who spread the news. Wherever they met, at the stream for laundry or the well for hauling, in each other's kitchens, shelling peas or putting up preserves, around each other's hearths, quilting. Wherever they gathered to work, they talked. For them, words and work were inseparable, and since they were almost never idle, they were almost always talking. Of course, the fathermen and the young people dismissed it as gossip. But they listened eagerly enough whenever the old women felt disposed to share information, and they grew nervous when the women shuttered their eyes and wouldn't speak. Everyone knew that no matter what anyone called it, revelation or rumor, it was crucial to survival. There was a deliberate morality to this process. Too sophisticated to believe in objectivity, the old women acknowledged their biases, yet trusted each other's different partialities to maintain balance. They did not pass along to the general community news that was untrue or unproven, lacking in insight, merely cruel, or leading to no solutions. This was how the old women had developed and refined a system of ethical governance in a mode forged to feel ageless, organic, and invisible. It was how they constructed, nurtured, and enforced the social order. Without their ancient form of intimate communication, usually nicknamed for food, dish, juice, morsels, tidbits. Other information, however presented, tasted superficial, bland data lacking context and the nuanced seasonings of analysis, mercy, or judgment. This was long before people would come to forget that a human mind, repeatedly assaulted by torrents of unconnected details, begins to lack the desire for using such information, especially to effect change, particularly profound change, which the old women sought subtly to inspire. They did so by their one art, the virtuosity with which they practiced gossip. So naturally it was the old women who were the first to notice, then verify among themselves, then spread the news. The child Daki could read the river. The river had no name. Its name was the river, just as the villagers called themselves the people. Village life, health, economy, communication, mobility, everything vital to the people depended on the river. Naturally, over millennia, this reliance had fostered periodic experiments, as generations of villagers studied whether or not, and if so, how, to influence the creative and destructive powers of the river, to placate it, perhaps even domesticate it. One such experiment had been to worship the river, bargaining for favors with gifts of sacrifice and flatteries of supplication. Another had been to dam it up, another to divert it, another to shore up the banks. But given sufficient time, rocks dislodged by the rapids, gouged and destroyed every dam. The flow refused to follow diversions. The current overbrimmed every reinforced bank. At whim, it seemed, the river dropped its level to near dry sandbed, or it mysteriously muddied and thickened, and it seemed to flood when it wished, heavy rains or not. Yet all the experiments over time worked until they failed. But, argued the fathermen, there was no way to be certain about one experiment, the effect of worship. Perhaps the floods might have been worse, or the river might have dried up more often, or might have drowned more incautious victims in its rapids, without the ritual offerings cast into the depths. So did the non-response of their deity elicit in many villagers, who formed a group calling itself the followers, the inspiration to continue, even intensify, their worship. This one experiment was thus retained, and in time it was becoming part of the people were becoming. Nevertheless, despite or because of this belief, some villagers never surrendered, arguing that there must be a way to fathom the river so as to harness its powers. The fathomers were smaller in number than their religious neighbors, but no less devoted to their own pursuits. Moreover, each of what became two factions had its own internal schisms. The followers were ceremoniously observant, but split into numerous sects and subsects, ranging from those who believed the river was a god and must be prayed and sacrificed to, through those who believed the river was a metaphor for God, yet should be prayed to for the exercise of faith, to those who weren't sure the river was anything but a river, yet considered it wise to worship on the safe side of things. Meanwhile, the other non-religious faction, the fathomers, scornfully rejected a safe side of anywhere. Yet they, too, splintered, though only into two sub-factions, those who believed the river was not a god, but mused that it might be somehow sacred, and longed to grasp what that meant, and those who felt the river was neither a god nor sacred, but who wanted to understand what the river was. The two major factions had begun their dialogue amiably enough, since they shared the goal of understanding the river. But once the followers gained more adherents on the safer, thus more popular side of things, they had a revelation. They realized that a majority could not possibly be wrong. Earlier they had proselytized the Fathomers from concern for the latter's welfare. Now they did so from their own zeal. When this pressure met with resistance, they began to view the Fathomers as a threat to their hegemony, and so denounced them. Faith, not proof, was the point. They had once regarded the search for proof as benign, in itself a type of faith, in the existence of proof, however elusive. Now they rejected proof as destructive. The Fathomers, first irked at being proselytized, then offended at being pressured, and finally infuriated at being denounced, felt besieged. Grievance and besiegement, combined with smaller numbers, can inflate self-righteousness from a comfort to a certainty. So the Fathomers announced that proof negated any need for faith. They had once regarded faith as harmless enough, sometimes even useful during the long, difficult search for proof. Now they rejected faith as destructive. Soon the followers accused the Fathomers of being arrogant, aggressive, and condescending in believing themselves abler to decipher great mysteries. The Fathomers accused the followers of being ignorant, uncurious, and superstitious in their insistence that mysteries were knowable. After generations of this, the functions and the factions rarely spoke, except in acrimony. They feared and detested each other so heartily that their differences, not the river, had become the subject. In the end, the only thing that united all sects of both factions across mutual loathing was the search for how to control the power of the river. Yet this unifying motive was no longer acknowledged by anyone. And now, suddenly it seemed, the child, Daki, could read the river. The old women said so. If the news hadn't come from that source, no one would have believed it, for at least 3 reasons. First, who could read rivers? The grandfatherman alone dared scry the river's moods, and then only in abstractions describing what, according to the Fathomers' scorn, everyone already knew. "The waters are troubled today," he would interpret gravely before performing the sacrifice of a lamb offered in placation to the roiling current. Second, the villagers were plain people. It had been only 12 centuries since they had learned to read words on parchment, and only 10 since they possessed their own codices, mostly for recording trade. A few villagers exchanged letters downriver with relatives or friends who had left for the valley or journeyed so far as the city. Visitors rarely passed through. There was little time, given the demands of farming, fishing, and herding, to read for any reason other than practical utility, so reading was not held in particularly high esteem. They employed a woman to handle the lowly tasks of tracking trade records, chronicling births, marriages, deaths, and the like. Third, Daki was an unlikely savior. One who couldn't even read words, much less rivers. A strange, silent child, orphaned by the river, shunted from one household to another. Separate swift rainstorm risings had claimed Daki's father when he fished, and then mother while she scrubbed clothes on the bankside rocks. Daki had no sisters or brothers, and had no friends. Children felt uncomfortable around someone who they thought simple in the head. Cruel ones laughed. Kinder ones smiled vaguely and hurried off. Already 8 years alive, Daki went unschooled, and had to be supervised when pressed into helping out at harvest or shearing. But since no one seemed much concerned, the orphan also ran a bit wild, disappearing for days, sometimes glimpsed wandering alone by the river bank. Certainly no one thought any child, especially this one, capable of succeeding where fathomers, including young, strong sunmen, and what followers, including mature, sage fathermen, had failed. Still, the old women said so. The child, Darky, could read the river. This information, once circulated, was considered sufficiently urgent to convene a special village meeting, the result of which, after much solemn discussion, was to send to the city for a grammarian. The grammarian was quite young, and understandably proud, as she was the first woman to hold that post. She sent word back that she could hardly be expected to travel to a remote village to solve some impossible riddle about an urchin claiming to read rivers, since she was busy with important matters. This was less than completely true. She was at that moment learning how to fire clay in her pottery class, a hobby she felt she strongly deserved. The young grammarian, aglow with her fresh triumph as an historic personage in the profession of her father and uncle, had begun to realize that the long-coveted post for which she had labored so ambitiously required that she waste herself, as she complained, largely on tasks she did not wish to perform. Nevertheless, after the villagers beseeched her again and again, she relented and made the journey, traveling through the summer heat in a rosy haze of martyrdom, an attitude that helped prepare her for the moment when she was shown her accommodations at the tiny inn. The grammarian was audibly unimpressed. Nevertheless, she called for the child to be brought to her for interviewing, a meeting that would have to be brief, since she must return to the city the next morning. So Darky was brought to her and stood sullenly staring at the inquisitor's feet, which were shod in elegant boots of soft crimson leather. The villagers backed away and left the two alone. 2 hours later, Darky burst out of the inn scowling and ran off along one of the riverside routes to solitude. The village elders assembled in haste to await the grammarian's emergence. When she appeared, she did not invite them inside, but addressed them from where she stood, framed in the narrow doorway, fanning herself with a silk kerchief. Not knowing what else to do, the villagers squatted or sat down on the ground, where those in the front row found themselves staring at the crimson boots. "Well," she began, clearing her throat, "it was difficult to get the child to talk, but I succeeded." She flashed them a self-congratulatory smile. "I have my ways." The villagers applauded politely. She nodded in acceptance and continued, speaking with the excessive certitude employed by persons anxiously unsure of their subject. "It's all nonsense, of course, and ridiculously primitive. The child claims the riverbed is composed of both subject and object, which is to say, theme, argument, thesis, substance, text. The rocks in the rapids are nouns. The current is tense, past, present, future. Everything is both subjunctive and indicative, which is absurd. Flotsam and foam are adjectives." The villagers gaped. "The child just describes. He didn't give these things their proper grammatical names. Of course, I did that." The villagers stared. "Oh!" She trilled a short laugh that seemed to emanate from some internal bubble of genuine humor. "And the fish are verbs. That's quite delightful." There was an embarrassing silence. Every villager was concentrating hard to comprehend, well, any of it. Then the grandfatherman stumbled to his feet. "But," he began tentatively, "what does all that mean? What is the river's message?" The grammarian looked shocked and a little affronted. She seemed to rock back on her little red heels. "You," she replied coolly, "fail to understand who I am. I am the grammarian." People stole glances at each other. Somebody coughed. But the young grammarian was a woman of self-discipline. She managed to transcend her impatience and to smile with a facade of studied tenderness, a face one might aim at small children incapable of grasping complexities one was stooping to teach them. "I am the grammarian," she repeated more loudly, as if they hadn't heard her. "I didn't ask about meaning." Then she announced that she must retire, since she would leave early in the morning to return to the city. And so she did. But not before shutting the door to her small, bare room, where she sat down on the hard cot, kicked off the red boots, and thoroughly soaked her silk kerchief with tears of sadness, for herself, for the crazy waif, for these ignorant peasants, for the whole unbearably poignant world. The young grammarian frequently suffered such emotional fragility of late, since she was living with the desolation of having got her wish. For the villagers, however, life provided no such desolation, and her departure seemed to end the inquiry. It was getting on to autumn when, during the quarterly season meet, the old women again raised the issue that the child, Docky, could read the river. This time the reminder was met with some irritation from both fathomers and followers, as it was generally thought rude to raise a problem if no one knew how to solve it. Besides, by now both followers and fathomers were comfortable in their settled enmity. The old women, apparently, were not. Then the schoolmaster spoke up. He was a mild man and shy. He had stuttered as a child, but persevered until now he was schoolmaster, cheerfully offering education to people free from much interest in it. He had grown accustomed to their indifference to, even rejection of, learning for its own sake. They tolerated his odd habit. He loved to lie out and study the starry night sky, even in cold weather. But if a fact or idea wasn't related to crops or herds, he could rarely convince them to encourage their children to study it. Perhaps in this opportunity he saw a chance to redeem himself in their eyes, or perhaps it was merely his own curiosity, which, though cramped by his circumstances, remained eager. In any event, he offered to try to get Docky to share whatever meaning the child read from the river. That the local schoolmaster might succeed at what the city grammarian had failed, or declined to pursue, was the source of merriment. But since the schoolmaster good-naturedly chuckled along with the rest of the villagers, and since no other options were available, and since the old women, after all, had said, the villagers decided there was no harm in letting him try. So the schoolmaster set off to find Docky. Meanwhile, his neighbors turned their attention to serious matters. It was shearing time. When he returned almost a month later, the schoolmaster came alone. He said he had left Docky living upriver in a little hut he had helped the child assemble from branches, twigs, and stones, and sod. Docky already knew how to gather food, edible roots and herbs, from years of forest wandering, and the schoolmaster added, smiling, "This child knows how to catch, cook, and eat verbs." Some of the old women expressed concern about the child's welfare, living away from the village, but the schoolmaster assured them that Docky loved the hut, and that he himself would look in on the child regularly. No one else cared. A few villagers even muttered that seeing less of the weird orphan around the village would be a relief. But when the schoolmaster began to relate what he had actually learned from the child, his listeners' mood changed. "Docky says," he told them, "that the river doesn't mean. It doesn't signify doesn't mean? Signify what? Demanded a farmer. Anything at all. But what does it want from us? A herder asked. It wants nothing from us. No devotion, no sacrifice. It calls out to us not at all. But, he went on slowly, the child says we must learn to read it nevertheless, and listen to it. All of us. The schoolmaster wanted to add that he knew this was a paradox, but then he'd have to explain what a paradox was. Besides, he had to contend with a rising growl from his audience. But what does that mean? What's the point of listening to the river if it's not listening to us? This is what you have to tell us after spending all that time with the mad child? The schoolmaster grasped his sole fact and clung to it. Daki did say one other thing as I was leaving. Something is happening to the north. It does things to the river that sadden the waters, or slow or thicken them, or harm the fish. But he had lost his listener's attention. Crestfallen, he watched them drift away, certain followers pointedly letting him overhear their disgust. A few fathomers, faithful to their mission of trying to understand whatever they could, nevertheless announced they would send a group of 3 upriver to investigate what the northern villages and towns could be doing to the river. A few days went by. Tempers seemed to calm. Everyone, including the schoolmaster, returned to reassuringly familiar duties, except for certain sect leaders of the followers. These fathermen, despite their ongoing competition for devotees, united in vocal outrage at the schoolmaster's message. This outrage they expressed generously to their neighbors. One morning, Daki, wandering through the village as in the old days, was greeted with taunts and a rain of pebbles, and quickly ran off. Hearing the commotion, the schoolteacher rushed out, yelling at the attackers, a gang of followers, sunmen. Then he turned to follow and comfort the fleeing child. But at that moment the 3 fathomers were sighted returning from upriver, waving and shouting that they had news. They did indeed. 4 different northern villages were making changes to the river. One village had built a seasonal dam. One had constructed a water wheel to irrigate their fields. One had drained their marshy bogs into the river each autumn, so they could gather and dry peat for winter fuel, and one had taken to burying their dead on the banks, too, to ensure the souls would be borne out to sea. None of these actions were new to the villagers, since at different times in their own history they had practiced them all. What astonished the Fathomer delegation was the revelation that if these same actions were taken upriver, it affected those downriver. Even after some upriver activities ceased, the effect might persist downriver. The villagers were the people, so this had not occurred to them. They knew other villages along the river existed, of course. They traded with them, despite knowing themselves superior. But this news, the concept of durable, intimate connectivity, disrupted their sense of what was real and shattered the assurance of centrality. Worse, in such unsought but unavoidable connectivity, they could not only be affected by others, but by inferior others. Meetings were held, arguments shouted. Many followers declared that nothing could affect the river except supplication and sacrifice, adding that the Fathomers, as apostates, doubtless invented this news from the north. Many Fathomers contended that followers were being willfully blind to clear evidence. People stalked out of meetings, but the old women insisted they return, and finally a sufficient number of individuals on both sides reasoned their way through to a compromise. Another delegation was chosen, this time from both sides, as emissaries to the northern villages. They were to bring gifts and initiate discussions about how villagers living along the river might work together so that none would suffer from actions taken by others. This process, lengthy, arduous, and over the following centuries incrementally successful in cooperation and alternately lethal in belligerence, is its own story. That is not this story. This story is about just how outraged the followers turned out to be. For one thing, where would all this end? What if there were villages further north along the river? How to know what they were doing? Must the people explore the whole world? And what time did that leave for farming and fishing and herding? And wouldn't their way of life be destroyed? And wouldn't they all then starve and perish? For another thing, the newfound interdependence between villages meant this village was perhaps not unique. That meant that the people could claim no special intimacy or even history with the river. Its villagers might not even be, preposterous thought, the only ones who were the people. But the worst offense was rooted in the schoolteacher's original report. Darky said the river cared nothing for devotion and sacrifice. Darky said the river called out to the people not at all. The river was indifferent. This was insupportable. It left nothingness, a dry abyss of despair. Still, just how outraged some of the followers were only became known after the schoolteacher went to look in on Darky's hut a few days later. It was late afternoon when he returned. His screams preceded him. He could be heard from a mile off, crying out, "Shame! Shame! Shame!" People rushed from their homes to gather in clusters, all chatter hushing as he approached. As he drew nearer, they could see he was staggering, lurching as if from grief to grief. He was carrying something they could almost make out. It was a form, not large, limbs dangling, an unweaned animal, a lamb or kid. "Shame!" the schoolteacher screamed, his voice cracking, his face a red blubber of tears and spittle. "Horror! Horror!" He stumbled toward a leader of the followers. "Stones!" the schoolteacher hissed. "You know. Hot ashes now." He licked his cracked lips and tried again, spitting each syllable out with effort. "Burnt hut, ashes everywhere, ashes, blood, and your stones." The follower stepped back, glance cast down. The crowd pressed closer. Then they saw. It was neither a lamb nor a kid. It was a bundle of rags. No, he was carrying a child. It was the broken body of a child, small bony brown legs dangling, twig-like arms crooked unnaturally, blood clotted on the little head, lolling against the schoolteacher's shoulder. "Never harmed a one of us, burned and stoned, left for dead. Who are we animals that we do this?" The schoolteacher began to howl, a lost animal himself. Two of the women who were healers rushed forward to lift Darky from the schoolmaster's arms. "I don't think," he cried. "I'm afraid." But the child's eyes fluttered open, and Darky murmured in a soft, high voice, "Don't need to mean. Just is. Anybody can see. Just look. Yes, the old healers almost sang. Here, give us the child. We can heal, we know ways. But Daki murmured again in that sweet, small voice. No secret. It just is. Everybody knows down deep. Then he smiled and died. The sun was cowering low in the sky by the time the old woman had finished bathing the bloody face, washing the broken body, winding it in their best spun linen. A few fathomers built a raft, placed the child on it, and bore it solemnly down to the banks Daki had loved. A few followers, moved by this act of reverence and a vague sense of collective guilt, walked beside them. Together they waded in, floating the raft out into waters that had claimed the orphan's mother and father, and would also claim the raft and its small burden as part of what now would be read as the river's meaning. The vessel and its occupant swept rapidly along the current, from past through present, to a future unknowable as the great open sea, riding waters that ran clear of flotsam and foam. Only a few fish, silver darts of energy streaking in the sunlight, accompanied the raft until it was borne out of sight. For 3 days and 3 nights the wailing of the old women never stopped. They had never meant to evoke such meaning. They had not meant to evoke meaning at all. They had meant for the river's ageless, awful silence to be heard. But they had failed to estimate what that might provoke. They had failed to gauge the people's vulnerability to 3 afflictions not all their healing arts could yet cure: the solace of ignorance, the versatility of fear, the satisfaction of cruelty. They had failed to imagine that such disorders might exact a fresh ritual of sacrifice, in which meaning was necessary and possible, but inflicted through suffering. Precisely the conclusion their subtle means of gossip had meant to prove wrong. But a few of the people at least had grasped the river's silence. This, the old women assured each other, they had at least achieved. In times to come the people would celebrate triumphs, abide setbacks, and exaggerate, then forget both. But the old women did not forget. They never made that mistake again. This was easy enough, since, being old, they had few years to live. What was hard was that younger villagers usually didn't believe them when they spoke of it. Not that it made a difference, ultimately. When we gaze up into the dark vastness sequined with stars, we grow serene, knowing that we gain perspective, seeing reality the way it is. Yet what we gaze at is the past, the way reality was, long before we could perceive it. That story was The Child Who Could Read Rivers, from Parallax, published by Spinifex Press. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on social media at The Robin Morgan. You can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net, and you can find my new novel, Parallax, and my just-out new book of poems, Harvesting Darkness, wherever books are sold. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Views expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer, as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer for this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us next time on Women's Media Center Live.